Thanks everyone for joining us today. As Sarah mentioned, this is the session that I did in Las Vegas last week for the Power Platform Community Conference. So yeah, very nice to make it there, and the session went well there. So I'll just dig in and make us start. So, for those who don't know who I am, just a little bit of background. My name's Keith Atherton. I'm a Power Platform Solution Architect at A&S Group, and I get up to some other shenanigans as well, as you can see. If anyone wants to connect, just feel free to scan that QR code or search for my name. I'm pretty active on X and LinkedIn. What we'll cover today is code optimization, architectural optimization, some user experience considerations as well, and monitoring as well. Now, just a little warning, there are a lot of tips and tricks here, and I'm keen to share as many as possible. So one thing I'm going to do is go fairly quick fire and go through as many as I can. So if something goes by too quick, or we don't have time for questions until the end, you can always watch the playback of this. Hopefully it will explain things a bit better. So first up, I just want to talk about why we want to optimize Power Apps. Now, really, the main thing is to improve the user experience, which we hope will improve the user satisfaction. And the key to that is really improving that user adoption. We really want to kind of give a really good user experience, and ideally, people actually find it enjoyable to use the apps or the solution at least as well. The other thing to bear in mind as well, that there might actually be a non-functional requirement or an NFR that might dictate things like app load or screen load times as well. So it might be something that you might have to adhere to. Along those lines as well, there are several performance models out there. I was a web dev and a pro dev for many years. I still dabble a bit. And there are performance models such as the Rail one, which the Google Chrome team came up with. And really, again, it comes back to user experience, is that they want the users to be happy and have a good experience. Now, Rail actually stands for the following. So R for things like respond to user interactions, when they click a button or something like that. A for animations, I for idle time, and L for loading the page content. So the actual metrics that they measure for the Rail performance model are the following. And that's after a lot of research and study to see what works well for users. It doesn't always have to be immediate, but within these kind of timeframes. So again, not saying that we have to adhere to these on every project, but these have been proven to be really good metrics to follow. Some things with Power Apps as well, they do steer us towards performant patterns. So things like streamlining the data loading at launch, automatic incremental paging of data, which we'll get with galleries and so on, and caching of data for collections. However, there are potential anti-patterns that we can fall into as well. So some of these might be slow loading times, slow transitions between pages or screens, and difficulty updating and retrieving data. And there are many others as well. Now, the main focus of this session will be Canvas apps because in many ways they could be more configurable, which means we've got more choices to make, and choices can be good or they can be bad, or they're intended to be good, but they may have performance impacts. Some common examples we've got of anti-patterns of loading excessive amounts of data, pulling too much into collections, for example, transforming everything into collections, and overloading the app on start property as well. So in terms of performance design principles, there's 4 key ones that we'll be looking at, and there'll be a lot of overlap in some of these techniques as well. So things like optimizing the page loads, that's quite an obvious one. Small data payloads, just targeting the data that we need. Optimizing the query data patterns, and having fast calculations as well. So first up, we'll look at some code optimization, and this will be really the bulk of the session, I would say. So we've mentioned it already, but the app on start property, many of us know it, many of us use it. So the example we've got there, setting a global variable, x to the value of 1. This is just on the app object, the on start property. So this runs when the user starts the app. However, if it does too much work, we pull too much data or do too much processing, it may run slow, which causes the app to load quite slowly. And even in the Microsoft Learn documentation, we can see a short snippet there, which is quite wordy. But the short version is they even flag, it can cause performance problems if you do too much work on there. So there are alternatives we can look at that don't just mean it has to be on the loading of the app. So some of the options we've got is the app start screen property. Now this is where we can actually determine which screen we go to. You actually might have a hard-coded one if you want, or like in the example there, we're checking a parameter passed in, a parameter called admin. Is it set to Y? If so, go to screen 1 or screen 2. Awful screen names, I know, but the point hopefully stands that you've got that decision where to go. So you can have that with, say, deep linking using the launch function, or you can display your own custom loading screen and actually give some feedback to the user to say how long it's going to take to load that screen. Another option we've got as well is screens have an on-visible property, so we can actually defer the work to the actual screen that's actually needing that data to be pulled or the calculations to be processed. So the example there, screen 1 on visible property, it's setting a context variable, then a global variable. So again, instead of putting it all on the app on load, it could actually just be per screen, and it's a bit more of a just-in-time approach. Another one, and it's a recent favorite of mine, is named formulas. And I've seen some good blogs about this recently as well, in terms of performance and name formulas from many brilliant people in the community. Now, with the name formulas, again, this is on the app object, and we can see an example there under the formulas property. I've got things like var word1 hard coded to a string, and so on and so on. And some do work on collections there that we can see. There are some advantages with this, like the formulas value, it's always available and up to date, and it's immutable, which is just a fancy way of saying that you can't change the definition. It's actually fixed like a constant. But the main one I've underlined there is that the calculation can be deferred. So these don't run when you load the app. These actually run when they get called throughout the app, no matter which screen or formula that they get called on. So the benefit there, it's another just-in-time approach, is that you take the performance hit when you call it. That calculation is deferred for when you need it. And if you never need it, you never get the performance hit. So it's really beneficial to do that instead of front loading everything on the app on start when it loads. The other benefit from this as well is it improves reuse, because that same definition there for that named formula could be used in multiple places instead of duplicating the code in several places throughout the app. And if you want to take the extreme option, you can actually disable the app on start property if you need to. So if you're running a team, running a department, and for some reason that is one of the standards that you really just want to outlaw the use of app on start, it's a bit extreme, but it is possible in the app settings. Personally, I don't do that. I still see some use for it, but it is there if you need it. So first up, let's get a bit geeky with some of the code. So this first one there is the concurrent function. And anyone who's done coding before or got a pro dev or pro code background might be used to terms like multi-threading or concurrency or parallel programming. And this is really a similar approach, it's the same approach effectively. So there with the example we've got, we're pulling from tables into collections, product, then customer, then so on. And if we check the network traffic in the web browser development tools, we can actually see they're actually done in sequence. They're done in order, where product's done first, then customer, and so on and so on. So if that was an app load time, for example, we can see that each step has had to be performed one by one. However, if we change the code and wrap it around a concurrent function, what we can do is actually set them all off roughly around the same time. So if it does that, we can see it's much faster because it's doing them in parallel. And it's only when that all four have been done will the PowerFX code move to the next block. So really all we've done is add one function, but if that was an app start time, we can see we've drastically improved the performance of the load. So really handy technique to use, particularly for data load operations, anything that goes slow. Next up, we'll look at some variable types. We've got some global variables, which we've got an example there, setting global name to Oscar using the set function. Now, these have got an app scope, so we can reference them anywhere in the app, and we can store things like numbers, records, Booleans, and so on. Another option is context variables. The example right there with update context, setting local energy level to 100. Now these have got a screen scope and can be referenced from only one screen. So the benefit with that is that we're storing the memory usage of that with the screen instead of holding everything globally that gets carried everywhere throughout the app. So it's more performance than overloading this heap, this global memory if we don't need to. And another one to mention there is collections. So like the global variables, these have got an app scope. You can reference them from anywhere in the app, and these typically hold a table. Now, another one to mention in terms of variables is that if you use the with function, we've got the example right there. The record we've got with the variables within them, they've got a formula block scope. So it's really just within this block, this PowerFX block, that temp title rather, in this case, is grabbed. It's used there only, and then after that, it's released from memory straight away. So it's really performant if we don't need to persist what we're using there. In this case, it is used, sets a global variable, and it's the global variable that would persist from then onwards. So yeah, just something to bear in mind. You can nest the with functions as well. And another handy thing with this as well, I saw in a recent blog, and it's something I've used many times, is that they can massively improve the performance. So with the example we've got there, we've got the with block. We're actually doing 3 lookups that are effectively doing the same thing. They're bringing back title, first name, and last name. Then we store them in global variables. So it's not particularly complex code, but hopefully it gives the impression of what it's doing. However, if that was to be refactored, so we do the lookup from the data source just once, what we do is we bring the record back and then take the columns that we need from the record. Again, title, first name, last name. So now we've reduced 3 data source calls over the wire to just 1. And again, this would be scalable if it was doing 5 or 10 or more of the same activity. It's really just going to, minimize what we need, take the values we need, and then move on. And the other benefit is this can often improve the readability as well. So because we've broken it down into smaller chunks with these, with these record variables, it's not one big gnarly, over complex PowerFX expression. So we do get a few wins by taking this approach. Another thing to look at as well, we had some examples previously of using the lookup function to retrieve a record's value. So in this case, we're doing a get user title. We're actually setting the global user record, doing a lookup on the users table, and actually searching for the user based on the email of who's signed into the app. And then after that, we set a global variable just to the title column of that record. So far, so straightforward. However, that first block that we do, we'll bring back the full record back. Now that might have many columns, maybe more than we need as well. So again, it's bringing more data back than we perhaps need. What we can use in the lookup function is a reduction formula. It's an optional parameter. We can see it's the 3rd one there in the syntax. And as you can see from the description there, is that what it does is it evaluates over the record and it reduces it to a single value. So if all we need again is just that title column or some kind of calculation to be performed, we bring back 1 instead of the entire record. You can reference columns within the table. So the example I've got, I'm going to use is just going to bring the title back. And again, if you don't use it, like in the previous slide, we could see it's bringing that full record back from the table. Again, there could be a good chance it's more than we need to bring back, and it might go slow as well. So if we look at an example here, which is just a tweak to what we had previously, instead of bringing back the full record and then get the title, we're doing it in one fell swoop just by using lookup and setting that reduction formula to title. So again, much more performant typically using it that way. Next up, in terms of table data and bringing it back, this is the users table. Many of us might have seen this one already. See things like full name, business unit, and primary email. But if we look on the right-hand side, see there are a lot more columns, like a lot more columns. And some of these common data model tables that are auto-created, they might be quite heavy on the schema. They might have a lot of columns that we may use or we likely wouldn't use. So again, bringing back the full record might be a problem if it's as heavy as this. So what we could do, one option is instead of bring back in this example, all of the users table and all of the columns into a collection called col users, we can see a bit of a preview of the data being brought back there, or at least the columns being brought back. Another way we might be able to use show columns. So we're targeting just the columns we need. So in this case, we just want full name and primary email. We're being very explicit. We just want those two back. We can see we've got a table with just those two columns. And again, we've targeted just the data we need. It can make a massive performance in the a massive improvement in the performance, but again, just giving us the relevant data that we need as well. One note I'll say with this as well is that there's something in Power Apps called explicit column selection, or ECS. And what this does is try to automatically compute which columns we need from the data source. Tries to be helpful for us. So if you've got a text label on the screen saying full name and one with primary email that refers to those columns, ECS tries to bring just those back for us and not bring everything else back. I would say I found this has not always been reliable. The times when I've used it, but if I do use the show columns approach, which we've got there, I'm the one being explicit about what we want to bring back, and I found it's always reliable. So I just thought I'd mention that in passing. As well as just bringing back the columns we need, also just retrieving the rows that we need is very valuable as well. So in this example, again, we're pulling from the users table, everything from the users table into a local collection. And I'm actually showing it in a gallery right there. And we can see we've got 146 rows. Not crazy, but it might be more than we need. Another example is by using a filter. So I've actually filtered it where I live in Edinburgh. In this case, with the sample data, it's just bringing back 17 rows instead of the 146 because it's targeted what I need to bring back. Another similar approach as well is by using Dataverse table views for galleries as well. So this first example, I'm using a gallery. I point the data source to the users table. And again, I'm bringing all the records back. It may not be what I want. It may be more than I need. So what I've done is a similar approach where you can actually specify the view in the gallery. You don't need to bring back the full table, the full data set. You can actually create your own view or use one of the existing system views and actually, again, just target the data you need to bring back so it's not too heavy. And again, it should run faster if it's a filtered collection as well. Another note on that as well is that not just Dataverse, but many other relational database management systems as well, SQL Server, Oracle, many others, MySQL, they've all got the concept of views as well. Similar thing, you choose how you filter it, typically with the where clause, the columns you need with the select clause, and the kind of sorting or ordering with the order by clause as well. So it's not just specific to Dataverse in this case. Okay, another thing we could consider is using Power Automate to populate a collection. We've got an example right there where, again, we've been explicit on the columns we need, the filtering of the rows, which is very important, and the sorting we've got. And there's a bit more going on there as well. So the benefit with this, if we do offload it away to Power Automate, is we keep the app a bit more responsive and it's asynchronously running away on a Power Automate Cloudflow. But there is also an impact with that as well, that by calling Power Automate Cloudflows, it needs to have some kind of launch to instantiate it. There could be a small performance hit, and it needs its own memory as well. Effectively, it's running another process as well. So again, there's no perfect answer here. It just depends on the solution. Do you need to keep the app snappy and responsive, or can you afford the user to wait for just a second or two for it to pull the data back? So it depends on your own solution, I would say. Another thing is caching data where possible. Cache is just a fancy way of saying that you're storing the data locally in memory. That's often why games, when you see games, you have the loading bar at the start. It takes a while to load things because it wants everything in memory to be snappy when you run the app or the simulation. It doesn't need to be going back to the data source every time to pull the data. That would give quite a slow, laggy performance. So really, that's kind of why they work the way that they do. Now with this, what we could do is actually pull the data or any values and store them locally in variables. So the example there, we've got one at the top with saving it as a record, the next as a column value, a single discrete value, or saving it as a collection as well. Now, the benefit with this is that if you refer to this cache data, instead of going all the way to the data source and back, it's typically much, much faster because it's held in local memory. So again, depends on the use case, it might be appropriate. And by the use case, it's worth bearing in mind, how often does that data change? Is this an overnight or a weekly refresh? In that case, loading at the start of the day is fine. Does it change every hour, or do you need real-time data? And if it does need to be real-time, you may need to go to the data source every time to get that data as well. Another thing to mention as well is there are ways of patching records that can improve performance. So many of us might be familiar with this approach there, where we've got a for all loop. We go through a collection, in this case, call accounts, and then we do a patch one by one on all the records. Quite common, quite readable. However, there is another approach where they can all be patched simultaneously using this approach called schema match. It's actually less code as well. And there's some good blog articles out there as well. Matt Devaney, Craig White, many other people have explained how you can do this and other fast patching options as well. So again, it's sometimes just a refactoring of the code, but you're going to get big benefits from it. A few other kind of random tips and tricks that I'll throw out there as well. Things like having over-engineered or complex designs that we may not need. Things like avoiding cross-screen dependencies. So if you've got one control on a screen referencing a control on another screen, it often has to keep them both in memory, which again could be doing heavier work than it needs to. You could change that by just calling the other screen and passing some context variables, and that way you don't need the full screen in memory. Things like avoiding galleries nested in other galleries or any kind of complex UI. And talking of galleries, we've got an all items count as well, which means we don't need to grab all of the items from the gallery into account rows. We can actually just refer to that property, so it's quite convenient. Considering screen transitions, this was another good one I saw blogged about recently, which is a way of, do you need that screen transition? If the user's got a slow device, a slow powered mobile device, or a slow data connection, often that might be a bit jittery or laggy. So you might want to consider no transition. Do you need a transition? Do you need fade or cover? Avoid overuse of timers as well. This is one I saw recently where a solution, it was a Canvas app that had 3 timers, but actually it only needed 1 with some conditional switch logic in there just to manage everything as part of it, because timers can actually have quite a performance impact. Considering data source refreshers, back to that cached example we just talked about as well. Do we need something that's refreshing a data source every 10 seconds or every minute? Can it be reduced? Does it have to be done every time you navigate to the page? There's things to bear in mind there. If you're using any offline features, the native Power Apps offline feature that went GA earlier this year, I believe it was around March, is really performant, and it's often much more performant than coding your own load data, save data approach as well. So worth bearing in mind. And also things like publishing your app regularly as well. This is in Microsoft Learn. They do recommend, because the engine behind Power Apps does get updated quite often with security and performance upgrades, something as simple as republishing the app means you'll take advantage of those upgrades as well. So that was a lot, but that was the main section. The next bit we'll look at is really some architectural optimization. And sometimes this doesn't need to be complex like this diagram. It just means standing back and seeing the bigger picture of how things are working together. So things like uploading media, you can upload images, audio and video files to Canvas app. So they're actually there, they're actually local to the app, ready to use. There are some size restrictions, which are mostly designed to kind of protect us. So we're not uploading like a 2 gig video or anything crazy like that as well. So there are some things to try and guide us to not, bloat an app. And things like images as well. If you use SVGs, scalable vector graphics, they're typically much lighter than a bitmap-based image like a PNG or a JPEG. It's really because an SVG is really just the maths, the plotting of the points that would actually draw the image, and it also keeps the resolution well when you scale it large as well. Another thing to bear in mind as well, if you're using Dataverse image columns, they actually auto-generate thumbnail images for you. So if you're repeating them in galleries or you want just a small size, not the full resolution of an image, using those thumbnail URLs that they provide for you can actually give you really good performance too. Talking of uploaded media as well, sometimes we upload media or connect to a data source and so on that we no longer use anymore. There are some very convenient ways of removing these automatically, so you don't need to manually go through them one by one. So things like removing data sources not currently in use, there's a button for that. Same again for the media, and same again for any unused flows as well. So instead of having to, again, trawl through and do this manually, which for some of these have done in the past, there's just a handy way to say, hey, there's no link, no dependency. I'll just get rid of it for you. So yeah, really useful. Another thing to mention as well, many of us might do this automatically. In fact, I only added this quite last minute because it's just kind of like, second nature. It's just one of those things that many of us typically do, is by using the app checker as well. So app checker is good at highlighting any errors and warnings for things like formulas, accessibility, and so on. And one of them here is the performance. So we can see the example there. For performance, we've got 12 warnings, 10 for unused variables, which we can then click and then remove. And there's two of them there for the rows retrieved from the data source may not be complete. Again, when you click on it, shows you where it is, how to fix it, gives you the guidance about what to do next, what to do about it. Okay. One other thing to mention as well, and this is a bit from maybe a pro dev standpoint, really, is a monolithic design. So really, some background there, a monolith or a monolithic app is typically an app that's doing too many things. It might have hundreds of screens or hundreds of data sources. It might creak under the weight of that and even load slow because it's having to put so much into memory. So a common thing, again, in the pro dev world is splitting this into multiple microservices or micro apps. And it's often with the mindset that each one of those smaller modular apps or services does one thing very, very well. So that could be something that naturally happens over time. A monolith, might sort of grow and evolve over time, but being able to split things up into multiple apps, you can still have a seamless experience by launching between the apps by using the launch function and passing some context variables. So if you pass those parameters, you might jump between a different app and then actually take a user to a certain page or a certain form with a certain record ready and available as well. So there are options to break up a big boulder of an app if you need to as well. Some other useful Canvas app settings as well. I'll fly through some of these, but we've got things like the new analysis engine, which is turned on by default. This is really the authoring experience, not the runtime user's experience. So this is just makes it more performant. Again, if you've got a bigger, complex monolith app, it might take a while to load in the studio. This is going to help. It can be turned on. You can turn on the setting for older apps as well. Things like keeping recently visited screens in memory. Again, many of these are on by default, but this is back to that caching design pattern we talked about. Very, very performant. And same if you're looking at mobile devices like iOS and Android devices, there are ways you can optimize them for those devices as well. So most of this has been about Canvas apps. Again, they're very customizable, very modifiable, but there are some things we can do with model-driven apps as well. There's a lot more than this, but I'll share just a few. So things like the form default tab, all those controls are going to have the initialization logic invoked when you load it. So if it's very busy, they're doing a lot, that might take a while. You might want to consider splitting them into multiple tabs or streamlining the UI in other ways. Things like data-driven controls, things like quick view forms, subgrids, and timelines, many others as well, they can affect the loading speed because effectively, under the bonnet, behind the scenes, I should say, they're actually doing lookups or joins to other tables, working on relationships. So again, if they're complex or have a lot of data, they might cause some performance impact as well. JavaScript, I mean, you could probably do a whole session on this, but in terms of JavaScript, if you're doing client-side scripting, there are many things. One of the key ones is asynchronous network requests, where you can cleaning up memory, avoiding memory leaks. There's a lot you can do just to keep it performance and not do things again in loops or in a cumbersome way, or anything that might kind of cause any kind of performance issues. You can also use the solution checker. It analyzes client and server customizations, and it gives you some results on that and where to go next with them as well. Very valuable. We've also got a couple of things in preview as well, like performance insights and object checker as well. And I'm sure they'll evolve over time and be more useful. Again, things to look out for with model-driven apps. So one thing to mention as well, we've got thoughts about us as makers or developers about optimizing the way we work as well. So in ProDev, there's quite a common concept known as dry or don't repeat yourself. Again, it's just a way of doing things like avoiding duplication of effort. And again, it may be that you have the same code in 5 places and you change 4 of them but forget the 5th. It can lead to problems as well. So in terms of reusable items, we've got things like named formulas that we've already covered. Components, which you can use within a Canvas app and can actually be used multiple times on one screen or multiple times on several screens, say like a header bar or a menu. If you want to abstract that further, you can move components to a component library. So we can actually reuse them across multiple apps as well. So it's taking it to the next level. And also things like user-defined functions. It's still experimental the last time I checked, but this is really just named formulas, but with parameters. So very, very useful. I did ask last week of the product team, and they're going to come out soon into GA, whenever that will be. So hopefully sooner the better. And we've got the concept of low-code plugins. Again, another thing in preview that I'm hoping to get in GA, because it means that technical as well as non-technical people can write Power Effects to create these plugins that can run instantly when you call them like a function, or they can be run automatically like the current C# plugins do as well. So a lot of power, and you don't just need a geek like me to be able to code it. Like anyone's going to be able to create that. So it's going to be super, super useful. So again, fingers crossed they come out soon. One thing I'll mention as well, I've learned this the hard way, trust me, about with the data versus data model, about the concept of over normalization. So it's deliberately not readable here, zoomed out, but on the left, we've got quite a complex data model, which is very normalized, which means the data's only saved in one table. It's not duplicated or summarized in any way. But what I've actually needed before is maybe a bit more of a compromise on the normalization, a bit of a simpler data model, such as the one on the right. Now, the reason I've gone for complex on the left is my background with SQL Server and Oracle. Those two mostly for most of my career is you typically normalize them as much as you can. So again, in terms of normalization, so you store the data only once and you avoid that duplication. And it keeps it consistent and accurate. You only change it in one place or set it in one place, and it's just referred to there, the single source of truth, if you will. However, from Microsoft Learn for Dataverse, they do say, however, sometimes you need to duplicate some data to make queries faster and easier. There's a few reasons for this. And again, this is kind of anathema for me because it's the opposite of what I've done for most of my career. You wouldn't want to duplicate ideally, but they do advise that you balance the two goals for the app design and the table structure. Now, this is mostly because a lot of Dataverse, it's abstracted for us. We can't get to that lower level quite easily, and it's mostly in Azure SQL database tables under the bonnet for the most part. Is that we can't actually do much fine tuning and manual performance tuning that we would typically do, excuse me, with SQL Server or Oracle or something else. So really, because we're at the mercy of the auto tuning that it's got, sometimes it pays to flatten that structure a bit just to kind of keep it lightweight where possible. Similar to this as well is avoiding too many lookups in a gallery, and that's where I came across this problem the first time. I had one table that had 8 lookup tables that pulled all of the other lookups and drop downs, and it was just too much heavy lifting. It went really, really slow. It was awful. So I had to refactor it and go back to the drawing board. That pattern's known as the n squared, or more commonly as the n+1 pattern, and that's quite well known in sort of data engineering as well in terms of relationships and structure. And again, for this, you can consider denormalization, sometimes duplication of data, or things like views, or even a concept of a summary table that's just there for a handy reference to refer to. So along those lines, again, duplicating the data might be slow to access if it's in a different location or a different format. You can make the query faster. You can copy that slow data and store it locally into a table that you can refer to. You could have a background process that performs this. It could be a Power Automate Cloud Flow, a data flow, or things like SQL Server stored procedures that maybe run in the background once an hour, once a day, something like that, and kind of keeps them up to date. But again, with that, we come back to that caching problem. If we're doing that and it's once an hour, is that good enough? Our solution, we might need some real-time data, or you might need it every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes. So it's worth bearing in mind that that data will get stagnant, and we need to bear in mind like how up to date, how often we refresh it as well. Along those lines as well, Dataverse has got long-term data retention. So with the diagram there, we've got the active data that we typically see in the table on the left. It's ready to use, it's ready for transactions, it's live and in use. We can set up some rules that move things into inactive data storage. So that's more for long term. And that way, if we need to refer back to it historically to see it for audit reasons or legal and compliance, we can actually run a query, typically a little bit slower to retrieve that data back, but we can get it if we need to for any reasons of, hey, why did that change? Who created that record and so on from 2 years ago or whatever the case may be. And then if you need to, you can move it to deleted if you no longer need it anymore. One little heads up on that, we do need managed environments last time I checked for long-term data retention. Also things to bear in mind, sometimes simple things of are your users close to where the data is? Sometimes it's the region that we have for the environment. When we create them, we've got the choice of, is it UK, Europe, certain locations in the US? Same with on-prem data gateways. Where is that LAN? Where's your network? Where is that stored? It may be in a different region. And the same with any kind of online data sources, such as Azure SQL database. So for those of us who've created them in Azure, you create a resource group, put the resource in that group, but you do choose regions for them as well. So it could be that, hey, your global team in the US has created it there, but most of your users are based in the UK or vice versa. So just worth considering where that data is held. So briefly, I'm going to go through a Canvas app data sources. We've got 3 options for this. So we've got things like an online data source we just mentioned there, such as Azure SQL database, on-prem data source, such as a SQL server on your local network on premises, or Dataverse itself. So I know many of us might be familiar with these kinds of options very, very broadly, but really, just think about, which one of those is going to be the best performance. So just to go through those 3. So for the online data source, I mean, this is getting pretty geeky now, right? But I'm going to go through it quickly anyway, is that when we go to the online data source, we've actually got to go through 2 layers to get to that data source. So we've got to go through API management or APIM, the connector, and then we get the data source. That's on the request. But on the response, we've got to go through them both as well. So there's a bit of a performance impact with that. If you go to an on-prem data gateway, we now get a 3rd layer. We've got the actual data gateway we've had to install that manages the cloud to on-prem network traffic as well. So we've added a 3rd layer. So there's now an extra barrier when we go to the data source and return as well. However, when we go to Dataverse, that's a direct connection. We don't need APIM. We don't need anything else. It goes directly there. So inherently, it's got the fastest connection. So Dataverse is the winner, right? Well, yeah, in terms of the actual connection to the data source and back, it is. But one other thing to bear in mind is what processing you're doing at the data source. If you know your stuff with SQL Server and you're using advanced performance tuning, using things like creating table indexes, you're using compiler hints or something quite low level, you might actually have like a super lightning fast performance there. With Dataverse, again, you're at the mercy of auto tuning to an extent as well. So it doesn't, even though the connection is faster, this is not the full story. It's just worth bearing in mind what you're doing at the data source itself as well. In terms of what we do at the data source as well, I mentioned delegation as well. So just a bit of background, delegation is where you run the Power Effects query in the app. And if the data source is capable, it actually does the processing, like the filtering, actually at the big powerful data source and just returns the results that you need to the app. And if you can't delegate, it might try and bring back all the data to the app, which is going to be slow and too much data, and then try and do the filtering and everything in the app itself. So really, we want to use delegation where possible. Now, the screenshot we've got there, it shows just one of them, which is for Dataverse, a breakdown of, hey, if you use equals or filter or lookup, depending if it's a number, text or choice or whatever it will be, can it be delegated or not? So in this case, I look at equals for a number, it's going to be delegated. But if I look at things like search for a number, it's not going to be delegated. So typically we'd get warnings in the Canvas App Studio to say if it's going to be delegated or not, so you can take other action if you need to. It's not just Dataverse as well. We've got delegation for other sources, and some of them are things like SharePoint, SQL Server, and Salesforce as well. And again, their lookup tables with the support are likely going to be different depending on the data source. So worth checking out if you're writing quite complex queries. Another thing as well, delegation is really important because with Canvas apps, we are limited to, by default, 500, but you can actually increase it to a maximum of 2,000 records to the app. So again, if you're pulling from a table, there's 3,000 records and you're not delegating it, you might get truncation of the data. It might just bring you back the first 2,000 records that it can find and not give the full story. So really important. So briefly, we'll just wrap up with a few things with user experience and then monitoring. So with UX, we've got things like a busy UI. If you've got too many controls, it's doing too much. Controls require memory, so lots of controls will need lots of memory. It's worth bearing in mind things that are repeatable, like galleries. And this is great, not just for business data that repeats, but if you've got menus with menu items, anything that repeats could be a good candidate for a gallery. Or you can consider splitting things into multiple screens or multiple tabs, whatever the case may be. It's likely going to give a better user experience as well as better performance too. In terms of giving users feedback, something's going slow. Let's say we can't help it. We know it's slow running. We need to give that. We've got things like out-of-the-box spinners that screens and galleries have. You can set the loading spinner and the loading spinner color, or you could upload your own GIF as well. That's always an option. And another few options as well with the modern controls, they've got a good spinner where you've got some text option and you can choose where it's aligned for the text. And you've got some other customizable options for the style and the theme as well. A favorite for me is the progress bar. You've got the indeterminate one, which is like the spinner again. It's hey, I'll get back to you, trust me, but it's just indeterminate. But the determinate one is good if you say, well, I know I'm going through 10 different things and I can actually give the progress on the progress bar to show when it's almost complete and when it does complete. So really valuable if you can provide determinate progress. Another thing useful, actually, just speaking about this with a friend just before this call, is with text inputs, you can actually turn on the delay output property. If you set that to true, the user input for the text input is registered after half a second delay. So this is useful, say, the search box with the gallery we've got in the screenshot. If the user's typing, we might not want any heavy filtering or searching or processing done on every single keystroke. We might want it done when the user's completed that search query. They've searched for a name. Only when they've finished, we want the work to be done. So again, as we mentioned, they're good for things like searching in galleries. And just to wrap things up, we'll look briefly at monitoring options as well to troubleshoot and debug anything that's going slow and then try and figure out how to improve things. So first up, we'll look at the Power Apps monitor. There's a screenshot right there. This is great because it's going to show you all the events when you're building apps in the Power Apps Studio, all the requests and response, was it successful or not, were there errors. It's good also for viewing events for published apps during runtime. So if you've got some kind of problem that's in UAT or production, but you're not seeing it in dev, you're not going through the code or adding any kind of tracing, you can actually hook into a session with a monitor and view it in a published app if you need to. We mentioned there as well, you can see things like duration of requests, how long is it taking, if there's any errors, and kind of dig a bit deeper if you need to as well. You can access this by going through the app checker or the advanced tools to get to it as well. Along those lines as well, we've got a trace function. There's an example there. You can record your own diagnostic information from behind the scenes. So you can provide your own message, a trace severity, things like information, error, warning, and so on. And you can create a record. I've got a silly one there that just says ID1 and name, which is my name. But the great thing with this is you can actually surface this in Power Apps Monitor that we just mentioned, Test Studio for those of us who are using it, and Azure Application Insights as well, which is great. You can use KQL, you can use that query language and surface those quite easily to the top as well, and bypass all the other events. So it's quite usable. So the example I've got there is actually just in the Power Apps Monitor. Another thing I've done just for a very quick way of giving back a duration, I've not wanted to go through Power Apps Monitor of every single event of how long something took. I've just wrote this Power Effects snippet that says, give me a snapshot of the date time before and after something runs, and actually just display notification to the user. So in this example, done in 2.297 seconds. So if I then tweak that code and run it again, I can compare before versus after. Have I made it better or made it worse? Who knows? And if you really need to, I've never had to do this with a Power App, but with ProDev, I've had to do this occasionally, is you can use the web browser development tools where you can actually profile the memory and you can look at it graphically. So like if you want to check out, the heap size and nodes, any listeners, you can dig to that level and say, look, have I got any memory leaks or some kind of infinite loops or performance issues there? But again, I don't think many of us would need it, but I thought I'd mention it in passing just in case. So yeah, it's there if we need it. So again, I did mention this is going to be quite quick fire, but I did go through code optimization, some architectural optimization, some user experience considerations, and again, monitoring to help debug and troubleshoot things if we need to. So with that, if you're still here, thank you for making it to the end. I really appreciate your time. And if there is time for questions, great. If not, just connect with me online. Always happy to help. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. I just was thinking how much work you've put into that presentation. That must have taken ages to do that.
There's a bit of work, yeah. It's funny because as I researched it as well, Craig had a good blog recently, a couple of things there. Speaking with Matt Devaney, had a couple of things, and then just my experience. So as it went, it probably doubled in size. And I didn't know if I'd get it done in an hour session, but here we are. So
yeah,
I'm not sure you've got enough tips there, mate. Can you share some more? I don't think that was enough.
Okay, you got another hour. Yeah, come on, let's go. Yeah.
No, any questions for me? I'm just wicked. I know we've talked about the subject before you went to Vegas in terms of performance stuff. And I know obviously Charles Sexton's covered it as well for his session over in Belgium this year. It's a common thing that I think people seem to forget about. Like we try and make apps look really, really pretty and try and make them not look like Canvas apps to the point where we forget about the actual usability of them day to day. And one of these tips isn't going to save you like a shed load of time, but adding them all, it's a sum of all the little things, isn't it? It's going to make an app that's performant, efficient, and survive the test of time. So all of those things are just as important as each other. So yeah, just some good feedback, mate. It was good.
Thank you.
And lots of things that I kind of abide by as well to some extent as well. And like, you speaking to the people, the product group about user-defined functions. We talked about that as well, didn't we, before you went away? I so hope they go into GA at some point because that would massively streamline coding logic, make things a lot more efficient. So fingers crossed on that one, right?
Yeah, big time. Totally agree with all that. And it's, as you say, using a portfolio of these techniques, even if it's not all, it's often just the mindset of I need to keep this snappy or streamlined or reused. And it doesn't mean you need to tick all the boxes, but the fact that it's front of mind means that you're probably going to search those techniques out or just be like, why is this taking 5 seconds to load the app? Oh, there's that thing called monitor. Let me just dig and see what's going on. Like, oh, there's some data source I don't need anymore. Get that out of there. Sometimes there's a quick win as well. But yeah, agreed. I think, yeah, speaking with Greg and team, Greg Lindhorst and Mike Stahl, the conference as well, they're very, very keen on UDFs and there's another function on the horizon as well that I'll mention as well called summarize. It's where you can do things like sums and averages, but it's a new method, a new function coming out called summarize that they're hoping to release soon. So yeah, more investment in that area, which is great news.
Were you allowed to mention that, by the way, Keith?
Well,
you have now, too late.
I have now, so yeah.
No, it's good. And again, it just shows continued investment in the platform to help us make it more performant, because that's what it's all about, right? So
yeah, and luckily as well, it was a public conference and not an MVP NDA thing. So yeah, but yeah, I just had to double check that. Yeah.
No, nice one, dude.
Thanks, man. Yeah, good feedback. Thanks, Craig. Right. Any other?
Are you blue?
Yeah. This is a filter. This is just my camera making me look like I'm in the Blue Man group. And
they were in Vegas last week.
I'm not going to fix this bug.
I love it. I love it. Go for it, Sean.
Yeah. For that long-term data retention policy, I haven't played with that one as much. Is it easy to access to the data? Like, if you want to push it back into your system, does it live elsewhere? Like, how easy is it to like query and use? I assume it lives separately.
Yeah, good question. I think I've only got to the tutorial level, not like full production with it as well. I think there's something, if I remember right from the documents, that correct me if I'm wrong, is the active data you can push to inactive, but you can't return it back to active. And delete is just the full nuclear option of it's deleted. I think what it's doing behind the scenes is moving it to a cool Azure storage tier because it's slow to retrieve when you run reports. So it still feels like early stages for me. But yeah, hopefully that makes sense.
No, that's awesome, because I love deleting data. I know so few companies who ever want that stuff from over 2 years ago, but this is something that, like, if it's super cheap, we can at least offer this, back it up. They'll never see it again, but then they have the peace of mind. But I'd like to know where, like, if things go horribly and we do need to access, what does it actually do?
Additionally, Sean, this works only for managed environments, this whole retention, so
right, we usually have money anyway, so they're going to be fine paying for it. So
sorry, folks, that was Teams crashing on me. Clearly not got performance optimization there. That was awful. So sorry about that.
You delivered too much today, like amazing amount.
Too many
of
slides for
tips.
Teams. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, hopefully it was useful. Thank you.
Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question and a comment first. So first of all, super awesome presentation, Keith. I wish I would have seen it in Vegas. I'm pretty sure the people were blown away. The thing is that the question is regarding, there was delegation. I was absent for a moment because some employees just distracted me, but we talked about delegation. I mean, delegation is one of the most important ones, right? Especially if you want to pull in a lot of data. I know with a new feature with Dataverse, they just moving delegation a little bit away, so they're not moving the data into the Canvas apps, but leave it on the Dataverse level. So then data delegation is not a problem there anymore. So have you the chance to try this out so far to see how this is from a performance perspective?
No, thanks, Bulent. No, that's a good one. I think I'll look into that one. I've not seen that. I've often again gone to those comparison tables, say, hey, here's the support you get, the ones you don't, and then workarounds of, hey, that's not delegable, so maybe I'll create a view sitting on Dataverse, sync with a big powerful server that would then just feed me that delegated data where possible. So no, that's a really good tip. So yeah, I'm keen to check that one out. Thanks for flagging that.
If I can give you a tip where you shared amounts of super good tips I learned today, and I'm super happy. So thank you very much again for the presentation.
You got it. Every day's a school day for me, so thank you. Yeah, I love it. Hey, how you doing, Piotr? How you doing?
I have a question about the number of controls, because since I remember, and this is like a very, very old recommendation, it was on a screen 300 controls.
That was it.
To place there. And did this change? Like, I see crazy apps, like people are proud of, like, I don't know, present like a Gantt chart with a gallery and a lot of controls. They place so many controls there. And so this is the first question. And how PCFs are counted then? If you build a crazy PCF, like for example, Scott Darrow built this drag and drop PCF that people also tend to use. Do you know maybe how those PCFs are counted? Is this a single control or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't know for sure. What I would do is maybe use monitor, or because it's offhanded to a different pipeline, I believe it might be some of those web browser dev tools when you dig to see the memory management. Because I think you're right. While it's technically, one control, it could be doing so much processing behind the scenes, and it's got its own interface with those, like init and the other methods that you call. So it could be that how free. Talking of Scott Giroux, he did a good session on this. I believe it was last year, the European Power Platform Conference, about how to optimize PCF controls, minimizing refresh rates, and digging to that low level, like good coding techniques on them. And he had a whole session based just on improving the performance. So yeah, I think you're right. It's one control technically, but a different beast. So probably needs its own session probably. But yeah, good point. Yeah.
Thank you for the great session.
Number of controls is an interesting one, I think, that you raised, because I can't find the documentation that I know existed where your original recommendation was no more than 300 controls per screen. That then changed to we don't recommend any more than 500 controls in an app. And those numbers aren't specified on Microsoft Learn anymore, as far as I can tell. It's just the advisement of the more controls in your app, the slower it will be, and therefore you might want to think about breaking it up into separate apps or using components. The numbers used to be there, but I can't find them anymore. But there used to be some loose recommendations. So what I say is use the code review tool, and it'll count the number of controls in the app for you, so you get a rough idea of how many controls are per screen and what your loading patterns might be. But
great tip. Yeah,
they've hidden some of that stuff.
I think the same with updated.
But maybe with like the fewer new model controls and fluent UI tier and stuff, maybe there's less of an impact on. I don't know. Like, I'd be keen to kind of know, is there like a secret number that we should be adhering to, but they won't tell us, and why? I don't know.
I think you're right.
There was a page that went out a couple of months ago saying that it was 500, but the recommendation was keep it below 1,500 controls before performance is impacted. Right. And that page has then also disappeared.
Really. Okay. It's funny, isn't it? Because it's good to have like the ballpark, but it's a bit like saying in a table, like, hey, that's got 500 rows, but is that a row where you've got 127 columns, or is it, and they're all massive images and files and blob storage, or is it, 2 columns and you've only got 2 numbers in there? So it's a tricky one, isn't it? It's like there's a control and there's a control perhaps. So maybe the mileage might vary, but yeah, good point. The code review tool is a really good shout, actually. Yeah, good to check that.
This hint about show columns when collecting to collection is also awesome hint. Does it work with SharePoint also? Do you know, Keith? Or
not top of my head. Yeah, that's a good question. I would hope it would. And again, just give you back what you need. But I'm keen to check after this now. Yeah,
I don't think it's delegable.
Okay. Another SharePoint.
I think there was a WhatsApp chat where we had there was a conversation, I can't remember what it was. We were talking about the explicit column selection thing and how really annoying it is. And so people use show columns to force the columns you need, to obviously hide the system columns we don't want, but to make sure the app knows the columns we want to process. But I think there's some delegation issues around using show columns. Okay. I'm not sure they are, I've not tested it, but it might be something to kind of go and test, especially as SharePoint probably has a few more delegation things to work around, and perhaps Dataverse or other paid for Dataverse based tools.
Premium. Yeah.
Premium, that's the word I was looking for. We'll have to test though, because I think it's a good technique, but yeah, I think it depends what you're burying in that show columns as to whether how well that's going to respond and bring out the data you need, I think. But
brilliant.
We'll have to test. Yeah. Sure.
Really good shout. I think I dropped off early when Sean was asking a question or giving a comment. Did you get that answered, Sean, or anything I can help with?
No, you nailed it.
Oh, well, that's very kind. Thank you. But yeah, I thought I dropped off as soon as it wasn't because you gave me a difficult question. I'm like, I just crashed Teams. Honestly, it just crashed. So yeah.
Cool. Thank you. That was, my head's obviously spinning after all of that.
Mine too.
My little brain is not computing all of that information, but no, that was brilliant. Thanks so much, Keith. It's nice to share it so soon after Vegas, because anyone who couldn't make your session can watch the recording back now. Fab. Okay, well, thanks. Have a good evening, everybody, and I will hopefully see you all soon.
Yeah,
All right,
thanks
take
everyone.
care.
Have a good
Thanks,
one.
Keith. Top
See you
man.
later. Cheers
Bye.
all.